Most pilots have no idea what's under the cowling of their airplane and why it matters to them as pilots. I'm David Twyble, a flight instructor and corporate pilot, and today we're going to look under the hood of my 1946 Luscombe to see what's in there and why it matters to us as pilots. So let's get started.
All right, let's get started here. We can see that both the propeller and the cowling are removed. And first up, we have kind of the core of the engine, or the central component, which is the crankcase here. We can see the crankcase is gray on this particular engine, and the crankcase is made out of aluminum. That makes it a lot lighter than what you might find on some other cars of that era, which were usually made out of cast iron or steel, and were much heavier. So we're right out of the gate, we're already lighter than the automotive world. Now these crankcases were cast in sand molds with aluminum. So you can see that the surface of them kind of looks a little bit like what you might see the sand at the beach. Now the crankcase goes from just behind the propeller flange here back to about here. And then we have some space behind there, and we'll get back to that in a little bit, what's back there. But we're going to just focus on what's hanging on the crankcase at the moment. So the crankcase first and foremost holds the cylinders. Here we have numbers 1 and 3 cylinders, and then over here we have cylinders number 2 and 4. That's how Continental numbered them, and you can see that we have a little number right here which tells us which cylinder we're dealing with. So this is a 4-cylinder horizontally opposed engine. And something we'll get back to in just a minute, if we look down on the top of the engine, we'll actually see that the cylinders are slightly staggered, where the numbers 2 and 4 are slightly forward of cylinders 1 and 3. They're not directly opposite each other, and that's on purpose, and we'll get to that here a little later. So here we have the cylinders hanging off, and they originally came from Continental like this, painted black, gray crankcase and black cylinders. And these cylinders, first and foremost, we see have air cooling fins on them. So we've got some big fins here, and then we've got some little fins here. And these fins are very important to keep our cylinders cool. So when you look in the front cowling of your airplane, you need to make sure that the fins on these cylinders are first of all, that they look right, they're not bent or damaged or bent over, and that they're not full of junk, right? Because if they are, you're not going to get effective cooling. So I like to think of these fins on a cylinder like a baked potato. When you have the baked potato just wrapped up in the foil there, it's really hot. But if you open the baked potato and cut it open and kind of mush it out, you increase the surface area, and then all the steam comes pouring out. And so that's what these cylinders are doing, is that they have lots of surface area. Each one of these adds tons of surface area and allows us to cool the cylinders without having to rely on water or some other method. So we have our cooling fins that we're checking for, and then let's start off in terms of thinking about how we get combustion in the cylinders from the fuel in the air, because we need 3 ingredients for combustion. We need fuel, air, and spark. So where do we get our air? First and foremost, we're going to get our air from this air filter right here on the front of the engine. So these air filters, it's just a oil-soaked kind of mesh that goes in the front there. They're really nasty to touch. We have to take them and clean them, or take them out and replace them every annual, and there your hands get nasty. But that oil is meant to kind of help grab particulate matter before it gets in the engine. And then we've got the carburetor airbox, and the carburetor airbox is right here, and we can see that the air comes in through the filter here and comes into the airbox. And then we have this little arm right here. And this is the carburetor heat arm. So if we moved this arm backwards, if this little thing rotated this way, we would get carburetor heat. And that's because there's a flapper inside of that airbox that pivots on this bolt right here. And when that flapper tilts this way, down, it allows air from here to come into the carburetor airbox and it blocks off the airflow from here, and this allows us to get hot carburetor heated air that we then use to melt any ice that we might have in the carburetor itself. So you probably aren't going to be able to see this when you are doing your pre-flight inspection, even if you have a really open cowling, which most modern trainers don't. But that's all it is. It's just a little flapper arm in the box there that allows us to choose whether we're getting air from the filter up front here, or if we're taking heated air from the exhausts from here and choosing which is going into the carburetor itself. So next up then, of course, is the carburetor. And this is the carburetor right here. And on these Continentals, this is what it's manufactured by a company called Stromberg. This is a Stromberg carburetor. And as we know, the inside of a carburetor is shaped like a venturi. And if you look at it from the side here, you can actually see some of that venturi shape where it's getting narrower as it goes up. And then once we get up into the throat of the carburetor, after that we have what's called the throttle plate. And so the throttle plate pivots on this arm right here, and we have an arm right here that's connected to our throttle. So this is actually our throttle linkage right here. This arm goes back to the throttle in the cockpit. So if we push forward on the throttle, that would actually pull this forward, and that then tips the throttle plate in the carburetor wide open, which allows more air to proceed into the engine. When we pull the throttle back, we tip that plate back and we restrict the airflow into the engine. Now we also need gas, because we're mixing the gas and the air in the engine here in the carburetor. So we come over here to this side and we see that in this container right here is where we actually get the fuel, and the fuel is metered from this box into the venturi, which then mixes with the air and allows us to receive fuel and air mixture into the engine. So if we follow this back, we see that there's a hose that runs down to our Gascolator, and that's what we're checking when we check this little guy. We push up on it and we get fuel out of there. We're checking for sediment and junk, because that Gascolator is the lowest point in the fuel system on this particular airplane. So the fuel comes forward out of the Gascolator, up through this hose, and into the float compartment on the carburetor itself. So then the magic happens inside the throat of the carburetor, where the fuel is atomized and mixed with the air. The air then proceeds up into what we call the fuel spider, because this is, you could also call this a manifold. This is a place where we're taking fuel and air mixture from one place and sending it out into 4 different places. So we have 4 pipes that come off of the fuel spider, and you can think of a spider having legs, right? So these are kind of the legs of the spider. And then these intake manifolds run up into our cylinders. So this is how we're getting fuel from the outside air mixed with liquid fuel, vaporized, and then brought up through the fuel spider into the cylinders itself. So once we have fuel in the cylinders, now we need to compress it, and we're going to do that with the pistons in the engine, and those pistons are connected to what we call connecting rods, which then connect to our crankshaft. So when our crankshaft is spinning, that's moving the pistons in and out. You can see the dirtiness on my hand there from touching the flange. And we're moving the pistons in and out, which is pulling and pushing air in and out of the cylinders. And the reason the engine is staggered, like we talked about earlier, where these cylinders are farther back than these cylinders, is because each of those connecting rods has to connect onto the crankshaft. And if the pistons were directly across from each other, or the cylinders were directly across from each other, then the connecting rods would bump into each other and there'd be no way to connect them up. So at least on this type of engine, that's how they get around that issue. On different styles of engines, they have different ways of getting around that, but that's neither here nor there at the moment. So we've got our cylinder piston pulling in our fuel air mixture here from the intake, and then we close the valves in the cylinders, and we compress the piston again, which compresses the fuel-air mixture, and then we ignite it. And here are our magnetos, so we can see that each cylinder has top magnetos and bottom magnetos. It has 2 per cylinder, right, on most general aviation airplanes. And we're going to follow those lines back and around, and you can probably guess to where these go. So we can see that these tops on this side come across here, back through here, and then if we follow these very carefully, they come to the right magneto right here. Okay, and then we see that the leads on the bottom here come up and across and over, and then they go over to the left magneto. And then let's go over to the other side. And again, we see that the tops come down and across here and over, and they go over to the right magneto. And then the plugs on the bottom come across here and go over into the left magneto. So the left magneto fires the bottom spark plugs on this particular engine, and the right magneto fires the top spark plugs on this particular engine. And so we can see our magnetos are back here on the back of the engine, and these magnetos are driven by gears that are connected to the crankshaft. And so those gears spinning inside the back of the crankcase spin, which then spins the magnetos, which then creates a magnetic field, which then sends an electromagnetic pulse down the wire, which creates our spark. And we have what we call timing with magnetos, and timing is how we make sure that the spark plugs fire at the right time in the cycle of the engine, and that is literally set by how they are mounted here, whether they're twisted this way or this way. So it's very important that the magnetos are tight and that they're not flopping around in the back of the engine. And because I have lots of room, I always just come back here and give them just a little bit of a wiggle to make sure that they are for sure actually tight. So that's how we're getting our spark up to our cylinders. And then once we burn the fuel air mixture, we need to exhaust it. And so here we see our exhaust pipes. And so the burned air fuel mixture comes down through here, comes down and out the bottom of this pipe on this side. So on this particular Continental, we have what we call a split exhaust, where the left cylinders exhaust on the left and the right cylinders exhaust on the right. On a lot of other engines, they mix the two together before they exhaust it out of one pipe. But I kind of like the split exhaust. It gives the engine kind of a nice puckata sound, which is very distinctive. And you can always tell a little bore Continental coming because they have a distinctive sound from this split exhaust setup. So next we need to look at what else is happening on the exhaust pipes. And on these we have heat manifolds. And these heat manifolds both have 2 hoses going into each one. So we have a hose here and we have a hose here. And let's backtrack down this hose up to here, and we see that we have an intake right here on the front of the engine for air. So air comes in across the cylinders and runs back into that hole. And then we also have one on the other side as well for intake air. So that air comes in through those hoses. It comes into the heat manifold here. There are then a bunch of fins inside of this exhaust heat manifold, which transfer heat from the hot air exhaust coming through here, and then transfers that heat into the air in this manifold. Now, at no time should the air from the exhaust actually mix with the air in these manifolds. If they did, that's how you could get carbon monoxide poisoning, because you would have a crack maybe inside of this manifold on this pipe. You know, if there was a crack here, that wouldn't be good. But if that crack was inside of this, then you could have actual mixing instead of just sharing heat, which is just the vibration and flying around of molecules bouncing into the metal, and then the metal sharing that with the air coming through the heat exchanger. We could have a very deadly setup for that. So we can see that the air comes in here and then leaves much hotter out this hose here, which then runs into what we call the firewall. And this is the firewall right here. This is a stainless steel plate on the front of the airframe itself. And it's called a firewall because it's meant to protect us from an actual fire. So stainless steel is much more fire resistant than just aluminum. And so that's why we call it the firewall. And so we are pumping that hot air through the firewall into the cabin, and that's how we actually get our cabin heat. So the air we breathe in the cabin comes across the cylinders, through that hose, down into the heat exchanger, and then back into the cabin. Now let's go take a look over at the other side, what's happening over here. So once again, air comes in through here, runs down into our heat exchanger, and then runs through this hose into our carburetor airbox, which we talked about earlier. But now we can't just let that air pile up in there. We need to let it out. And so that's what this is right here. This is the carb heat dump or carb heat exhaust. So when we are not using carb heat, that air exits through here. And so that keeps flowing, which helps keep air flowing through this whole system, which helps keep it from overheating. And so we dump that air out the bottom there, and then when we select that flapper up with the carb heat knob, down, when we select it down, we cover up this hole, and then the hot air can actually run up as we discussed earlier. Okay, now the next thing is what we call the engine mount. And the engine mount is what holds this whole 50-pound mass of material on the front of our engine in place so that we can fly safely. And so we see our engine mount right here up on top, and it runs forward to the engine in two places. And then we also have down here, the engine mount connects up to the bottom and top of the engine as well. So the engine mount is one piece on this airframe, and it bolts in on three places on the firewall. We already looked at two, and here's the third. And then we can see how it goes up and again connects to the lower engine, forward left engine mount, and then up to the forward or upper left side as well too, to bolt the engine in place. And so these engine mounts have rubber donuts inside of them that help reduce vibration, and that's why you're not shaken to death when you're flying one of these things, because the firewall mount or the engine mount, you can see some of the rubber there too sticking out. That engine mount helps absorb some of the shock and the vibration. Okay, next up we have some smaller things to consider, and the first one is going to be the oil temperature probe. So on the back of this engine we have this screw-in piece here, and this is actually our oil screen. So on these little Continentals back in the day, they didn't have oil filters yet. We just have a screen, and so that screen allows us to catch any metal that the engine might have shed, and it's kind of a poor filter, but it's better than nothing. And then inside that housing for the oil screen is going to be our oil temperature probe. And so that probe is just a little probe. Maybe we'll see it if we do an oil change video sometime. And it just acts just like a thermometer, right? When the heat increases, the fluid inside that expands, which then runs back through this line, which then moves the oil temperature needle in the cockpit. And then just past that, kind of hard to see, but right here we have what's called the tachometer drive. And the tachometer drive is just run off of a gear, and it spins, and the faster the engine turns, the faster that gear turns as well. And then there's a flexible shaft that runs through this line back into the cabin, and that spinning shaft then goes to our tachometer. Our tachometer then converts that into a needle position to tell us how fast the engine is spinning. So we've got that. And then over on the other side, we have our oil pressure line right here. So this is where oil pressure is tapped off the engine, and then a small amount of oil runs through this line and runs back into the cabin to our oil pressure gauge to tell us what kind of oil pressure we have. And so if you got a leak in this line, you would be leaking oil out of the engine. So what they do is they have just a very tiny hole in this line inside here, just what they call an orifice, to just allow a tiny little bit of oil in here. So, and it still transmits pressure, but if this started to leak, we wouldn't just blow all of the oil out of the engine right away. So that's really important too. Okay, a few other things while we're back here. We also have what we call our P leads on the Magnetos, and that's right here. You can see this. We pull that off. There's a little nut there with some electrical wires, and those electrical wires, along with a grounding wire, run forward into the cabin, which runs, as you might have guessed, to our Magneto switch. And so we can see that we have those lines right here, and then they run back into the cowling here. And so that then allows us to ground out our Magnetos to shut them off. So if we were to cut these wires off of the back of the Magnetos, these Magnetos would go hot and they would just run. We call that fail on. If the wiring to them fails, they just work instead of die. Because if we had a wire go bad, we wouldn't want our engine to quit. So those are our Magneto wires. And then we already looked here. This is our carburetor heat cable that comes out of the firewall and runs forward to our carburetor airbox here to control that. And we also have what we call baffling. So this baffling here, you can see here and here, runs up and over. And when the cowling is on, that helps direct the airflow around the engine so that the air runs over the cooling fins properly and doesn't get wasted not doing any cooling for us. And then one other thing here, we also have on this engine what we call an oil kidney, or what we would generally call an oil sump. And the oil sump is where the oil fill cap comes from, or where the oil dipstick goes into with the oil cap on it there. So that's where we're measuring our oil quantity from. And so that hangs on the bottom of the engine. And once the engine uses oil, that oil just falls down into the kidney where it lives until it's picked back up by the oil pump and then gets recycled through the engine. And on the bottom here, we have a drain. You can see that drain right there. And that's where we actually drain the oil when we do the oil change on the airframe itself, or on the airplane itself. So I think we've covered the majority of the components on this Continental A65 engine. And what we see is that in the grand scheme of things, this is very simple, right? There's, even compared to like a Cessna 172 today, there's a lot that's not here, right? There's no alternator, there's no starter, there's no vacuum pump, there's no standby alternator, right? There's no fuel injection. This is just a dirt simple engine. And so this is what's at the basis of most of our general aviation training airplanes. And then we then add components on the top of that. So when you're doing your pre-flight inspection, if you have access to the cowling, easy access that is, and your flight school or wherever you're at will allow you to open that cowling, you want to actually look in here and take a look around. You want to learn to identify the components, and then you want to learn what they look like when everything looks normal. And then when you see something off, like maybe you see a bird's nest in here, or you see, maybe it's happened many times, maybe the mechanic left tools lying in there, or you see that the spark plug leads aren't tight, or you see a crack maybe somewhere here or on the engine crankcase, or you see that hoses are loose and just flopping around inside of the engine compartment, that would be really bad. So the more you know about what normal looks like, the more you'll be ready for an abnormal situation. And I'm thankful to say that here on my Luscombe, I have really big cowling doors that allow me to look in. And on many, many occasions, I've caught in little things that would have been a no-fly item, and was able to get them fixed or taken care of before they became an issue in flight. Now, not every airplane is like that. Like I said, on a modern Cessna 172, you might only have the oil door up on the top right of the cowling. But even still, I like to pop that oil door open, shine a flashlight down in there, and get a look as much as I can. And even just on a 172 with that little oil door and, the opening on the front of the cowling, I've been able to catch numerous things that would have been dangerous in the air or were grounding items. So make sure that you're looking over as much of the engine as absolutely possible. And, even when the engine's in the cowling, you could have things where the engine is crooked, and the propeller's not sitting straight in the cowling. I've seen these airboxes here come completely loose and just be flopping around in the front of cowlings. I've seen exhaust pipes literally just hanging out the bottom of a cowling, and you go up and you want to make sure they're cold before you touch them. But you wiggle it and it's just completely flopping around in there. And none of these most of these weren't like mechanical issues where the mechanics screwed up. They were just things that broke with use. And so if you know what it looks like with the cowling off, you'll be more likely to catch an error even with the cowling on, depending on how much you can see. And one final bonus component that I missed here earlier is what we're going to call our case breather line right here. So we can see we have a fitting into the case here, and we just have a very simple tube that comes back and then runs down and then out right here. And what that does is it lets the inside of the crankcase breathe when heat builds up in there and when the pistons are moving back and forth, and it equalizes the pressure inside the case so that we don't blow seals or cause any issues like that. So there's one little bonus piece that I missed earlier on, but I hope you found this helpful. And make sure that if you ever get a chance, go out to the airport, find a mechanic, and tag along with them as they do an oil change or they do maintenance on your airplane, and learn what you have under the cowling. And the more you learn about these things, the more intuitive it'll become when you have issues in the pre-flight or even in flight. So until next time, fly safe.